Right now, somewhere on Earth, a hammer with a yellow handle is swinging. A tape measure is snapping back into its case. A utility knife is scoring a line through drywall. A cordless drill is driving a screw into a stud. In the time it takes you to read this sentence, another one of these tools has been sold somewhere on the planet, on a job site in Texas, in a hardware store in Manila, in a garage in Warsaw. Stanley Black Decker sells tools in over 175 countries, employs roughly 48,000 people, and pulls in more than $15 billion a year. It is, by almost any measure, the largest tool company that has ever existed. Its yellow and black colors are printed on tape measures in Brazilian hardware stores, on drill cases in Australian warehouses, on wrenches sitting in toolboxes in the back of pickup trucks from Ohio to Osaka. There is a very good chance that somewhere within arm's reach of you right now, a junk drawer, a garage shelf, a toolbox under a sink, there is a tool carrying that name. Now picture the opposite. Picture one small wooden shed on the edge of a half-frozen Connecticut river town in 1843. Inside it, a 41-year-old man who has already failed at 2 businesses is hammering wrought iron bolts by hand, alone, with nobody watching and nobody caring. He has no factory. No investors banging down his door. No brand. Just a hand-cranked forge, a stack of raw iron rods, and a stubborn refusal to admit that he might be exactly the kind of man who wasn't built for business. His name was Frederick Trent Stanley, and the space between that freezing shed and the empire that exists today isn't a straight line of genius. It's a mess of bankruptcies, a company that lost money in its own first year, a founder who quietly walked away from the business that bears his name, and a series of near-accidental decisions that somehow, against every reasonable expectation, built the biggest tool company on the planet. By the late 1960s, Xerox had a problem that most companies would consider an enviable one to have, an almost obscene amount of cash, and a genuine, well-founded fear about what would happen once it ran out of runway. The photocopier business, for all its explosive success, was still fundamentally a paper business, tied to a single core technology that Xerox's competitors were already working furiously to imitate and undercut. And Xerox's own leadership, people who had lived through Carlson's long, humiliating search for a company willing to take a chance on an unproven idea, understood something crucial. The next transformative technology wave, whatever it turned out to be, was probably not going to look anything like a copier, and a company that waited for that wave to arrive before responding to it would likely be too late, the same way General Electric and IBM had once been too late to see the value in Carlson's crude little smudge of toner on paper. If Xerox wanted to survive past the current century, it needed to own a piece of whatever came next, before anyone else even knew what next was going to look like. In 1970, the company made a decision that, in hindsight, was either visionary or completely insane depending on how the story ends. It founded a brand new research laboratory in Palo Alto, California, thousands of miles from Xerox's Rochester headquarters and its established corporate culture, and gave it an extraordinarily unusual mandate. Don't worry about copiers. Don't worry about quarterly earnings. Hire the best computer scientists in the world, give them essentially unlimited resources, and let them invent whatever they believe the future of computing should look like, with almost no obligation to ever turn a profit on any of it. The Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, as it came to be universally known, assembled, almost by accident of extraordinary hearing, one of the single greatest concentrations of computing talent that has ever existed under one corporate roof. Researchers like Alan Kay, who had a radical vision of personal computers designed to be genuinely usable by ordinary people rather than trained specialists, small enough and simple enough that even a child could learn to use one. Engineers like Bob Metcalfe, developing a way to link computers together over a local network so they could share files and resources instead of operating as isolated islands. a team building on the earlier, groundbreaking demonstrations of a researcher named Douglas Engelbart, who had shown the world, back in 1968, a strange wooden pointing device and the earliest glimpse of Windows and hypertext in what came to be remembered as the mother of all DMOS. PARC took those scattered threads of possibility and, working with a level of intellectual freedom almost unheard of inside a large corporation. No product deadlines, no sales quotas, just brilliant people given years to chase an idea wherever it led, wove them into something entirely new. On April 27, 1973, PARC unveiled the Alto, a genuinely revolutionary machine, arguably the first computer in history built around a graphical user interface. It had a high-resolution bitmap screen you could navigate with a mouse instead of typed commands. It featured a "what you see is what you get" editing system, letting a person format a document on screen exactly the way it would appear when printed. It was connected, along with more than 100 other Alto machines across the PARC campus, through Metcalfe's Ethernet network, letting researchers share files and send messages between machines in a way that felt, for 1973, almost impossibly futuristic. An office full of computers quietly talking to each other, nearly a full decade before most of the world had even heard the phrase personal computer. And then, having built the personal computer roughly a decade before the rest of the world would even agree such a thing was commercially viable, Xerox essentially did nothing with it. This is the part of the story that genuinely confounds business historians to this day. It wasn't that Xerox's leadership was stupid, or that the technology sat completely unknown and unnoticed. Executives back at Xerox headquarters in Rochester and Stamford saw the Alto. They understood, at least intellectually, that PARC had built something remarkable. But Xerox was, at its core, a company built around an enormously profitable, well-understood business model, leasing expensive copier hardware to corporations and making the real money on a steady stream of consumables and service contracts, year after year, from customers locked into long-term relationships. Selling a relatively inexpensive computer directly to individual consumers, at a price ordinary people could actually afford, was a completely different kind of business, requiring a completely different kind of company. Different sales channels built around retail stores instead of corporate account managers. Different manufacturing scale built around hundreds of thousands of cheap units instead of a smaller number of expensive machines. Different customer relationships built around one-time purchases instead of recurring service contracts. Xerox's leadership, comfortable inside a business model that had already made them one of America's largest corporations, simply couldn't see why they should reinvent themselves around it. There was no single villain in a boardroom actively suppressing the technology out of malice or fear. There was something quieter and, in a way, more universal. A company doing exactly what its existing incentive structure told it to do, optimizing for the profitable business it already had rather than the uncertain one it might someday need. The Alto never became a real consumer product. A small number were built, mostly for internal use and a handful of research partners, but Xerox's own organizational structure, its own institutional gravity, kept pulling the company's actual investment and attention back toward copiers. That institutional blindness might have simply become a forgotten historical footnote, a smart research idea that a big company failed to commercialize, the kind of thing that happens quietly inside corporations all the time, if not for one very specific, very consequential visit. In late 1979, Apple Computer, a fast-growing young company that had just gone public and was working on 2 new computer projects internally, negotiated a deal with Xerox's own venture capital arm. Xerox would be allowed to invest in Apple's pre-IPO stock, and in exchange, a group of Apple engineers and executives would be given access to see what PARC was working on. There were actually 2 separate visits from Apple that year. Steve Jobs attended the second one, arriving with a handful of colleagues to see a demonstration that PARC researchers, including engineer Larry Tesler, had prepared for them. What Jobs saw that afternoon was, by his own later account, structured around three genuinely distinct innovations: the graphical, mouse-driven interface itself, an object-oriented programming environment called Smalltalk, developed by Alan Kay's team, which let a researcher named Dan Ingalls live edit the interface in real time in front of Jobs' eyes, and Ethernet, the networking system linking over 100 Alto machines together into a shared, connected system. Jobs later admitted with startling honesty that he was so completely fixated on the first of those three things, the graphical interface itself, the windows, the mouse, the icons, that he barely registered the other two at all. Tesler, who ran the actual demonstration, remembered Jobs' reaction vividly. Packing back and forth across the room, his fist clenched under his chin, unable to contain his excitement, telling the PARC researchers directly that they were sitting on a goldmine. Daniel Bobrow, another PARC researcher who had been there since 1972, later recalled simply how amazed the Apple team seemed once they actually started seeing what the Alto could do, as if a switch had flipped somewhere behind their eyes. It's worth being precise here, because the popular version of this story, the one repeated in documentaries and dramatized in movies, complete with a scene of Apple engineers gleefully lifting Xerox's ideas like pirates raiding a treasure ship, tends to flatten what actually happened into something closer to a heist. Jobs didn't sneak into a locked building and steal secret blueprints. He was invited in, as part of a negotiated business arrangement that gave Xerox actual equity in Apple, a deal Xerox's own venture arm had pursued deliberately. He didn't out-invent PARC's scientists, and he certainly didn't copy the Alto piece for piece. Apple's engineers would go on to change and refine an enormous amount of what they'd seen, adding entirely new interface conventions PARC's own machine had never used, like pull-down menus instead of Alto's pop-up windows. What Jobs actually did, the thing that genuinely separated him from the very people who had built the technology he was looking at, was understand instantly and completely that a graphical interface wasn't just a clever research demonstration. It was a product, one worth reorganizing an entire company around, one worth building at a price ordinary consumers could actually afford, right now, immediately, with whatever resources Apple had. Xerox's own leadership had been sitting on exactly that insight for 6 years, and had simply never acted on it with anything close to that same urgency. Jobs left PARC that day, and set his engineers to work incorporating what he'd seen into Apple's in-progress computer projects, first the Lisa, and then, more consequentially, the Macintosh. It wasn't instant or effortless. Years of genuine engineering work went into translating PARC's research lab ideas into something that could actually be manufactured, sold, and used reliably by ordinary consumers rather than trained computer scientists in a research facility. But in January 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh, marketed with one of the most famous television commercials in American advertising history, built entirely around a graphical, mouse-driven interface that traced its intellectual lineage directly back to that one afternoon in Palo Alto 5 years earlier. It wasn't a total public secret. Either trade publications and industry insiders had known for years that Xerox PARC was doing extraordinary things, and reporters occasionally wrote about it. But knowing something is happening in a research lab, and actually seeing it delivered to your desk as a product people could buy at a computer store are two entirely different kinds of knowledge, and it was Apple, not Xerox, that closed that gap. Xerox, to its credit, didn't sit completely idle while this was happening. In 1981, 2 years after the Jobs visit, the company finally launched its own attempt at a commercial product built on the Alto's ideas, the Xerox Star. It was, in many respects, remarkable, the first computer to genuinely bring together file servers, Ethernet networking, print servers, and electronic mail into a single, cohesive office system, years ahead of anything comparable on the market, a machine that industry insiders who saw it genuinely recognized as extraordinary. But it was priced, quite simply, for a different planet than the one ordinary consumers or even most businesses actually lived on. A full Xerox Star Office installation could cost as much as $100,000, at a moment when a comparable IBM personal computer sold for roughly a tenth of that price, and a Commodore VIC-20, an entirely serviceable home computer, cost around $300, cheap enough for an ordinary family to buy on a whim at a department store. The Star wasn't a failed product because the technology was bad. It failed because Xerox, a company built around leasing expensive hardware to large corporate accounts under long-term service contracts, priced its revolutionary personal computer exactly the way it priced its copiers. For institutional customers with large capital budgets and dedicated IT departments, not for the mass consumer market that would eventually define the entire industry. The gap between what PARC had actually invented and what Xerox's own sales and pricing culture could bring itself to sell was, in the end, just as damaging as the original decision not to commercialize the Alto in the first place. The pattern repeated itself, with almost eerie consistency, across nearly every major technology park produced during that era. Ethernet, the local area networking standard PARC had pioneered to connect its own Alto machines, eventually became the foundation of essentially every wired computer network on Earth. But it was Bob Metcalfe himself who eventually grew frustrated enough with Xerox's inertia that he left the company to found 3Com, an entirely separate business built specifically to commercialize Ethernet networking equipment for a broader market that Xerox's own structure had never been positioned to serve. Metcalfe, in other words, had to leave the very company that employed him while he invented the technology in order to actually sell it to the world. The laser printer, another genuine PARC invention, did eventually become a substantial and profitable Xerox product line, one of the rare cases where the company actually managed to capture significant commercial value from its own research labs work, largely because a laser printer fit comfortably inside Xerox's existing business model of selling expensive office hardware to corporate customers through its established sales channels. That one success is instructive precisely because of how narrow it was. Xerox could commercialize an idea when the idea happened to slot neatly into the shape of the business it already had. The moment an idea required a genuinely different shape of company, Xerox's own organizational muscle memory took over and quietly strangled it. For nearly every other innovation to come out of that Palo Alto building, the graphical interface, the mouse, the very idea of a personal computer designed around a human being's intuitive sense of windows and icons rather than typed commands. It was other companies built from the ground up around the specific idea of selling that exact technology to as many ordinary people as possible, that ended up capturing almost the entire commercial and cultural legacy. It would be easy, and more than a little satisfying from a certain storytelling angle, to frame this simply as a heist. Brilliant young upstarts outsmarting a lumbering corporate giant too blind and bureaucratic to see what it had. But the more honest, more useful version of the story is something closer to a structural problem, one that shows up again and again throughout the history of large, successful companies, in industries that have nothing to do with computing at all. Xerox wasn't full of fools. It employed some of the most talented computer scientists of the entire 20th century, gave them extraordinary freedom and resources, and let them build things that were, by any measure, years or even decades ahead of their time. What Xerox lacked wasn't vision at the research level. It was the organizational willingness to let a genuinely disruptive new technology cannibalize its own wildly profitable existing business before market pressure forced the issue. Every large, successful company built around one dominant, highly profitable product line faces exactly this same dilemma eventually. Do you risk billions of dollars in current earnings? Do you reorganize your entire sales force, your entire pricing model, your entire corporate identity around a new technology that might not even work commercially yet, might cannibalize the very revenue funding the research in the first place? Or do you keep milking the machine that's already making you rich and let someone smaller, hungrier, and with nothing to lose take the risk instead? Business scholars would eventually give this exact pattern a name, decades later, calling it the innovator's dilemma, the observation that the very organizational discipline that makes a company excellent at its existing business is often precisely what makes it structurally incapable of embracing the thing that will eventually replace that business. Xerox, again and again, chose the safer path. And Silicon Valley, built by a generation of founders with genuinely nothing left to lose, chose the other one. The irony deepens the further you follow it. PARC itself never actually disappeared or shut down after the Jobs visit. It kept operating, kept producing important research, for decades afterward, quietly continuing to influence the broader technology industry in ways most people never fully connected back to its original source, contributing ideas that would eventually ripple into fields far beyond personal computing. In 2002, Xerox finally spun the lab off into an independent subsidiary, formally separating it from the corporate structure that had never quite known what to do with it, an organizational admission, decades late, that PARC had simply never belonged inside the same reporting structure as a copier division. And in 2023, more than 50 years after its founding, Xerox donated PARC outright to SRI International, closing the book on more than half a century of a photocopier company owning, funding, and ultimately failing to fully capitalize on one of the most consequential research institutions in the entire history of computing. Xerox itself, meanwhile, continued on as a company, still profitable for a long stretch of years, still a major player in printing and document technology, still a recognizable name on office equipment around the world, but never again came close to occupying the kind of position it briefly held in the early 1970s, when it had, for a few short years, quietly built the actual future of human-computer interaction inside one unremarkable building in Palo Alto, and simply hadn't realized what it was worth. There's a strange kind of symmetry buried in this entire story, if you look closely enough. Chester Carlson spent years of his life being told no by every major corporation in America, watching genuinely enormous companies fail to see the value sitting right in front of them, until one small, undercapitalized outsider finally took the risk that transformed both the invention and the company willing to bet on it. Decades later, Xerox, the very company Carlson's persistence had ultimately built, found itself playing the exact same role Carlson's original rejectors had played, sitting on a technology worth an almost unimaginable fortune, watching it, understanding intellectually what it might become, and still failing to act with the urgency the moment actually demanded. It took another outsider, a 24-year-old with nothing close to Xerox's resources but an unmistakable, almost obsessive clarity about what he was looking at, to do what Xerox's own leadership couldn't quite bring themselves to do: bet the entire company on it immediately before the moment passed. History, it turns out, doesn't just rhyme in broad strokes. Sometimes it repeats the exact same shape of mistake, inside the exact same company, one generation apart, and nobody in the room even notices the echo. So the next time you drag a window across your screen, or click an icon instead of typing a command, or watch your laptop find a network without you ever plugging in a single cable, remember where all of it actually came from. Not a garage in Cupertino, not a dorm room at Harvard, a photocopier company's research lab in Palo Alto, built by executives smart enough to fund the invention of the future and unable, in the end, to bring themselves to build it. Xerox didn't lose the personal computer because it lacked the genius to invent it. It had already invented it, years ahead of anyone else on Earth. It lost the personal computer because inventing the future and having the institutional courage to bet everything on it turned out to be two entirely different skills. And only one of those skills, in the end, was the one that actually mattered.